an inherent danger of the thrust. Hey folks, Matt Easton here, Scholar Gladiatore. So I've spoken many times about cut versus thrust, and as I've mentioned in previous videos, the reason I talk so much about cut versus thrust is because in a way it is the history of swords. If you're going to make a sword that cuts very well, often it's to the detriment of its thrusting ability. If you're going to make a sword that thrusts very well, often it's to the detriment of its cutting ability. I'm holding two swords which sort of typify this for the at least late 18th century, early 19th century. These are both late 18th century swords. One is a small sword, which is Georgian, and the other is a hanger or cutlass, which is also Georgian. They are both British and they're both Napoleonic era. And in fact, both of these types of swords would have been in use by infantry officers and naval officers, and that's specifically what I'm talking about here. Now, many of you will be thinking, oh, this is just Matt telling another story about how British swordsmen defeated someone else. And this one's going to be a bit different because this is actually about a French swordsman fighting the British, and it's translation of a source. And just let me put the small sword down. The weapon in question, well, there's a couple of weapons actually, but the weapon in question is going to be something similar to this. This is probably a naval hanger. The reason I say it's probably naval is because it has a white ivory grip. And white ivory grips, at least in British service, and this is a British Georgian example, usually the white grip indicates naval service. Not always. You do find yeomanry and militia swords sometimes with ivory or bone grips. And indeed in India sometimes British officers used ivory or bone grips, but very, very often it's the case that if you have a hanger or a spadroon, sword that I love of course, if you have a white grip, very often it does indicate naval service. So I'll just put that hanger down there for a second. So here is the account. As always, you can find it in various other sources, but it is in Swordsmen of the British Empire, and it is essentially a quote by Frederick Reinhardt, who was serving in Napoleon's army, and he was in this was in Egypt, and it's regarding an encounter with a British naval officer during a skirmish in 1798, so end of the 18th century, and he says. And this is incidentally taken from William Westall's The Battle of the Nile, and this was published in 1900, so it's presumably either he recounted this in English himself, many people were bilingual at that point, or it's translated, I don't know. But anyway, he says, in English, I won't talk French. So in English he says, I had a hot single-handed fight with the officer in command of the sailors. It was like a duel. He began by firing a shot at me with his pistol, which grazed my head and blew my cap off. Well, that's lucky, isn't it? Could have blown his head off. Then he drew, in other words, drew his sword, and set on me with his cutlass. So think more probably if it's a naval officer in the Georgian era, it's probably something like this, probably something we'd more often call a hanger. It could indeed have, I mean that is a short sabre, but it could have been a short sabre as well. It's possible that he did actually have what we'd conventionally regard as a cutlass with a shell hilt, but I think probably more unlikely as it's an officer. But we had not exchanged half a dozen passes before I found that I was by far the better fencer. For a minute or two I played with him. I think there's a degree of bravado in his account here, because you know you've got to imagine in a melee situation you're probably not taking it quite as lightly as he might make it sound, but you know I guess he can afford to sound proud at this point, sometime after the event. And then parrying a stroke which he aimed at my head, I ran my sword through his heart. Okay, interesting detail there. There's a couple of things. We can actually tell some specific moves here. So let's assume that he also has a hanger. He may have had a small sword, we don't know. But if you parried a blow to the head in the head guard, as it's called, up there, then he probably would have thrust in, I suppose that would be second, okay? But he could have perhaps parried high tierce, in which case he would have thrust perhaps in tierce, or he may indeed have parried at the head in carte, in which case he would have thrust in carte, or he could have parried in prime and then thrust in prime. So there's numerous ways that this could have panned out. He could have been with the hand down or the hand up, but I would say on average, usually if you parried a head blow, usually the hand goes up. So it probably would have been a thrust like that. Boom, straight down to the chest. I ran my sword through his heart when, with a loud cry, he fell dead. So that's interesting in itself, because of course I talk a lot about people sustaining wounds and then fighting on afterwards, and in HEMA, in historical fencing, we do generally, not always, but we do generally allow the afterblow. That is, when you hit someone, they're allowed to try and hit you back. This is mostly a training artifact. It's a way of forcing people to not go for sneaky little snipes, like sniping an insignificant target, and if they then get a hit afterwards, because what would that signal? That wouldn't help their training. It's better to train people to hit and then cover on the way out, because the other person might die instantly, like here, or they might not. So you should train for that not to happen, for the fact that there might be an afterblow. But in this case there wasn't. And it is important to note that when you're reading the historical accounts, it does seem that very often, particularly with thrusts to the chest, it does seem that very often people did just drop down dead, or at least drop down dying or incapacitated. So don't, if you're a HEMA person who's come into the HEMA world and been used to afterblows, don't think that afterblows always happened historically. They did not. Lots of the historical accounts describe someone being hit and just being out of action straight away. With a loud cry, he fell down dead. With such force had I delivered my thrust that my sword was wrenched from my hand, and I had some difficulty recovering it. Never in my life had I fought as keenly as I did in this duel, so great was my hatred of the English. There we go. A good example of the fact that I don't only read sources that are written by or recounted by British or English people, and the enemy is non-British. In this case, this is a French soldier serving under Napoleon, and he killed a British officer. Well done to him, I suppose. Someone had to win. But the most important part there, apart from the other things I've mentioned so far, is the fact that he thrust the guy went straight down. There's no implication that he fought back after being run through the chest, but then whatever sort of sword he'd been using, whether it was a hanger or whether it was a small sword, we don't know, the body essentially immediately dropped, boom, and took the sword down with it. And there are a surprising number, both with swords and other weapons such as bayonets and spears and all sorts of things. There are a lot of accounts that describe this sort of thing happening, where, and particularly with thrusts, and it is where, so we talk a lot about, when we talk about thrust versus cut, and I try to point out that one of the dangers of thrusting someone, of running someone through, is that your weapon is now in their body. And the two main disadvantages to that being the case is, number one, it might take you time to extract the weapon, and there are indeed some cases of where a person, like in the time available in the melee, just couldn't pull their weapon out. And the other danger, of course, is that it will take enough time to pull your weapon out that you can't defend yourself in that moment, in the moment when you need your weapon to be free in order to defend from whatever's being thrown at you. Your weapon's still buried in the person's body, and you're trying to pull it out, maybe with your foot on their chest or whatever, you're trying to pull it out, and someone swings a blow at you and you can't defend it. With a cut, whilst cuts, it's absolutely true, I think that cuts are generally speaking less fatal. And for two main reasons. One, because cuts by their very nature are less likely to cause the instant death than a thrust into someone's body or neck or head is. But additionally, cuts very often fall badly due to clothing, due to the cut not being given perfectly with the edge aligned or with enough speed in the blade or whatever, with a push and pull on it, these kind of things. It's much easier to mess up a cut than to mess up a thrust. Really, to thrust through someone in clothes is just easy. Okay, if you hit them with the point, they're going to get stabbed. Yes, absolutely, the thrust is more fatal more of the time, but it has that disadvantage of getting stuck, which cuts very, very rarely do. I have seen a few, and I mean really a handful of accounts where a cut resulted in the weapon getting stuck in a person, but by and large cuts just don't get stuck in people. Thrusts very often seem to have done. So there we go, to finish up there, a Frenchman killing an Englishman. That's the big surprise of this video, but the other thing is just to reiterate that the danger with thrusts is always that it can get stuck in a person's body, either for a long time, like permanently, or for long enough that you can't defend yourself. Cheers folks. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe, follow us on Facebook. You can buy t-shirts through Spreadshirt, support us on Patreon, or follow us on Pinterest. Thank you.